Chart Summary, 25th July data. A new feature, World Stats. These are summary tables from the chart update data. We'll show the start of a chart update to give context, then go into the tables. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. Here's the top 30, Sweden still at number 5 for countries. South America is moving up the chart, which is a bit bizarre and disturbing. The only non-agenda region to have a real issue, or maybe there isn't an agenda, who knows. In keeping with tradition, we start with Italy, the first badly hit European nation. Sad that it's showing clear fraud indicators, but again, it is what it is. They're indicators. Italy could be innocent, but we've got tight cases, death lag, 3 days, not 14, e.g. Germany. You die pretty quick in an Italian hospital. Fat tail out to side of autofit on cases and deaths. That's not a fraud indicator of itself, but cautionary. 11 times Hubei in deaths, 23 death days, when the Far East gets 0.1 times Hubei and 0.2 death days. 100 times worse than the Far East. Yeah, that's a hardcore fraud or a very different virus. You decide. They managed 69% of ordinary daily mortality at peak, again when the Far East basically flatlined, barely anything. Did the entire Far East lie? I doubt it. And 14.1% overall mortality. So whether fraud or tragic, Covid still didn't represent more than 14% of normal deaths during that period. An experience, not a reason to give up democracy and install totalitarianism. The death rate lagged 14 days, deaths today over cases 14 days ago, is our key fraud indicator. You're not supposed to die the day you go into hospital. Italy's at 159%, so more people died of Covid than had Covid. That's a pretty strong indicator that something's amiss with these figures. Sorry Italy, you look bad and not from Covid. Now we have a bit of a treat for you. All those figures on the right, hopefully you're familiar with the key ones, and we've just highlighted them for Italy. The new entries top right are the growth decline rates for cases and deaths, but that's not the treat. We've finally created a summary table not just of deaths for rankings, but all these figures, and we list it here for 135 countries, all those greater than 1 million population and greater than 1,000 cases. So this is the real Covid worldwide. I'll post them without comments so that they're here, but then we'll go through the main ones as charts and comment on that. So here's the 135 countries, plus New York City, each individually labelled. So we had to do a top and bottom to give Excel enough room to do that. So here's the world at a glance. Top and bottom scales should agree, so if they don't, my bad, let us know, but I think you'll find they do. So you really can compare top and bottom here. And by the time you get to the middle ranking of the top, so the end of the first quartile, 1/4 of the countries, Covid is really pretty much Covid, what Covid? But that's not really the story you see in our countries, is it? New York City, 225,000 deaths, reading it off the chart, normalized, i.e. per 100 million population. The US with Belgium, UK, Spain, Italy were the worst hit in the world. Sweden, whipping boy of the agenda, and then South America elbowing its way in. Seriously? All our science, all our healthcare, and somehow we can't cope with a virus that the rest of the world brushes off. And the virus is just a virus. It should not be targeting Western power centers. So what else is there in Western power centers other than, I don't know, rich corporates with an agenda maybe? This is the what the chart if you're seriously switched on and ready to ask how this can possibly be considered legitimate or not noticed by the media. It's also what the WTFU chart for all the compliant sleepers out there, as in wake the up. We'll keep the same order of countries as we go through the other charts, so sometimes you'll see the same characteristic, we're worst hit first, sometimes not. It's interesting to reflect on why not. Here's the same chart expressed in death days. How many standard normal death days does each country's normalized deaths represent? We use a 9 per thousand normal mortality for our standard, 900k deaths per annum for 100 million population, or 2464 deaths per day. So one death day is 2464 deaths from COVID in the entire experience. Now, even if the New York City figures were correct at 90 days, and not an absurdity compared to the rest of the chart, the US gave up democracy and freedom for the equivalent of 90 days normal deaths. Why did they bother fighting World War I or World War II, Korea, Vietnam, hell, even the Gulf Wars? You fight for oil, but give up democracy for a bad quarter's deaths. Ironically, of course, we in the UK are in even worse shape, because we gave it up for only 20-odd days. 3 weeks normal deaths, and that's an absurdity, but even if it was true, we gave up freedom for that. These are the official figures of what COVID cost us in each nation, and there's not one nation there that can possibly justify ending all that is fair and reasonable, and some of it was, for this. If the pure deaths figures are the chart of WTF or WTFU, then this is the chart of shame. Same figures, but translated into ordinary days mortality, to show how little COVID actually represented. I am both despondent and disgusted when I look at this, the utter shame and the sham, and nowhere will you see this chart or any of our work recreated by mainstream authorities. Go agenda. It's not quite identical but close. This is the percentage of overall mortality that COVID represented from the day of the first COVID death in each country. For half the world it's flatlined, not even a footnote in their history. Even from the bottom up to Germany, the rise is so gradual and the figure so slight, it barely warrants attention. You can actually count the number of countries in the world where COVID was actually more than 10% of overall deaths by our standard 9 per thousand measure. 10%. So it's not even a primary cause of death, not one of the big killers, and yet all round the world totalitarianism is in force because of it, including countries like Australia and New Zealand, where it doesn't even register on the chart. Flatlined, invisible, and yet the stories out of Oz and New Zealand are shocking. Locking down buildings, for Christ's sake. Oh, but it could get worse if it was let loose. We're only safe because of lockdown. It's a religion, a cult. We've gone to great lengths to show that lockdown didn't change a damn thing. But the combination of a massively exaggerated figure, fraudulent models, exponential curves, flattening the curve, and lockdown have created a mix so evil, it beggars belief. There has been no greater disinformation campaign in history, and no greater crime against the people of the world committed in its name by their own government. Wars and genocide, sure. Targeted conflicts, no argument. But a worldwide pandemic of misinformation to shut an entire world down. Nothing has achieved that before. Nothing. Not even religion achieved such a unifying reaction from the entire world's governments. It truly is Armageddon, the end of times. Not for religious reasons, but just because. It sucks. And there are precisely 11 countries, New York City is zero, ground zero for the agenda, but not a country, so he gave it index 0, who break the 10% mark, and that's with rounding. Ireland is at 9.7. 10 countries that read like a list are a list of the world's richest and most powerful nations, plus Peru, Chile and Brazil. What on earth are you guys doing down there? Top 3 with New York City representing the US, USA, EU HQ and the UK. I mean, how simple do you want it? Hello? And nowhere out there will you see this highlighted or noticed, because the people selling you this crisis are the ones controlling the government and media. You think? So soak it up. What the world looks like, how it shrugged COVID off unless you're living inside one of the lying, fraudulent Western power centers or South America. It's like they crashed a fraud party. Now if we switch to a less maudlin topic, cases, we see what a messed up world we now live in. Qatar, a COVID non-event pretty much, tops the world at 3.5 million cases per 100 million people. 1 in 30. Wow. But sure, where case used to mean you got sick, so you got tested, now it means you get tested because you're not sick. Brilliant. I always said it was a red herring. Now it's a tool for tyranny. Leicester in the UK, Luton UK, Melbourne, Australia, lockdown for cases. That means lots of people not sick. It used to mean sick, not anymore. Daily mortality. Again, a lesson in why you want to understand how results can get bizarre. The main story is to look at the usual suspects, and we're in the 50s to 100%, and the rest of the world at 0, or close to. So what is this? It's the worst deaths today over cases today figure. So with big countries, ours, reporting daily, the figure is going to be pretty reasonable, or not reasonable, but accurate. If you're a country that reports data occasionally, for whatever reason, and you have a few more deaths today but a quiet cases day, you'll get a spike figure, not representative. So when we see our newcomers, Peru, Chile for example, or Kyrgyzstan spiking, we'd have to look at their charts individually to see if it was characteristic of their overall mortality. What this is then is a fraud flag. The rest of the world is flatlined, COVID never representing more than the slightest fraction of a normal day's deaths. But New York City, it's 300% of a normal day. Belgium, 100% of a normal day. Seriously? When the rest of the world doesn't even notice it as a fraction of their normal day's deaths? And you want us to believe you? UK, 60% or more. You'll be able to see the exact figure from the chart update charts that we'll get to, but seriously, the rest of the world flatlined and you want us to believe 60%. I'll tell you what I'll believe, that the nation that backed the war of terror that generated the WMD scam or scare, that is home to Big Pharma along with the US and core EU nations that hosted a Gavi summit, I'll believe that the UK is a haven for powerful rich people who'd love to get more powerful and more rich, and who don't care about the little people, that would be us, or the ethics of a lie or two. And it really was that simple. Commissioner report, cost 40 million apparently, and a press conference, massive threat, 530,000 or 510,000 deaths, lockdown, wait for the vaccine. Simple. It didn't cost an airliner or two, they didn't have to mobilize the military, they didn't have to go to war, they just told you to be scared and you were scared, or the rest of your nation was. It is the biggest, cheapest and most terrifying coup in history, overthrowing democracy worldwide at so little cost and with the agreement and approval of the people. Terrifying, horrifying and very real. So what was the overall death rate in each country? Now here's a slide that debunks the COVID isn't real meme somewhat. All the countries in the world on this chart, 135 of them, had at least 1,000 reported cases, and I'd have to check Singapore and Uganda, but they're all showing deaths, else no death rate. But of course Singapore can't be listed above a deaths country with no deaths, we're ranking by deaths, so yes, it had deaths, which means it tested a lot of people to get that low a death rate. Thus highlighting how testing has again devalued the data, unless we go back to pre-testing days when 4% was about the world average. Uganda, though, is last on our list. It had 1,000 cases, but did it have a death? Nope. Still, it and the rest of these countries considered COVID real enough to report deaths and cases. Now, were they mistaken? Possibly, but let's allow that not every official in every nation is a sociopathic lying scumbag. Up at the top of the Western governments, sure, but the whole world? Remember all that indignation about Russia and China, or the, Muslim countries harbouring terrorists, while we're ruled by sociopathic, greedy, subservient, lying scumbags. So yes, every country is going to have a death rate reflecting the disease, or that once reflected the disease, but now reflects the degree of testing, or the disease, or the fraud factor. Another, oh well. So a low figure may be diluted by testing, hiding a high figure revealing fraud, but if the figure is high, then the veil is drawn back. So France, 18% death rate overall. What the? Bear in mind that since death rates vary by age, you can work it both ways, from age to risk of death, but also from risk of death to age. So the world average of 4% implies an average of maybe 50 years old. Or better treatment, it gets complicated, but an average of 14%? That's now only possible if you're killing off people at an average age of 80 or so. You can't dilute from the worst figure, and 14% is the worst. And to get an average of 80 years old, you've got to find 90 and 100-year-olds to balance the 60 and 70-year-olds. And just how many of those 90 and 100-year-olds does a country have? And then you have a world worst hit nation, which means a lot of deaths, which means a lot of 90 and 100-year-olds to balance a lot of 60 and 70-year-olds plus all your 80-year-olds, chances are. I mean, how did France achieve that? There are only two possibilities. They literally cleansed their nation of OAPs, or they massively lied about how many people died from or with COVID. Italy, UK, Belgium all at 14%, with France at 18%. So we, the richest, most scientifically advanced nations, with our free, taxpayer-funded healthcare, are what? To be the worst hit nations in the world at those death rates, we have to be engaged in either ethnic cleansing or reporting fraud. One or the other, or both. You just can't get those numbers without one or both of those. That most of the rest of the world is down at the 4% or so should be a clue. But it doesn't even depend on that. The scale of age versus death risk mandates that 14% means an average age of 80. Game over. Now we can also look at the maximum death rate recorded on their worst day. But it's a weak indicator because, as already noted, you have a slow cases day, a few extra deaths, suddenly it's a big number. The lag death rate, however, now we're talking. This is lag 7. Lag 14 is our primary indicator, and it's a doozy. It still has the sporadic data risk, which is why we need the charts. Here's Germany, which is a pretty textbook chart. That doesn't mean it's innocent, it just means it did things right. Alles in Ordnung. You're not supposed to die the day you go into hospital, and in Germany you don't. Notice the distinct gap between the blue cases record and the red deaths curve, third small chart from the left at bottom. Separated peaks 14 days apart, suggesting you survived 14 days before dying. That seems about right. Now check out the death rate day lag 14 figure at 14%. That's a coincidence 14-14. A bit high, close to max allowable, but fine. Now check out the red line to the left of that figure. The red, blue, green lines are lag 14, lag 7 and lag 0. To start with, you have cases, no deaths, low death rate. To end, you have deaths, no cases, high death rate on raw data, lag 0. However, start to lag it back, lag 7 days, deaths today over cases 7 days ago, and the early death rates rise. Yes, early cases, no deaths, but we'll wait and use deaths 7 days from now. With Germany and hospital data to say, yes, 14 days is reasonable, lag 14 gets early cases but waits 14 days, hence lag, to use the deaths from 14 days' time. So it's a more accurate death rate. Provided, of course, the cases were sick people and the deaths were deaths from COVID 14 days later. What happens if they add deaths not from COVID but don't compensate with higher cases earlier? Well, you get this. This happens. Spain. Deaths curves matches the case curve almost perfectly. You die the day you're a COVID case in Spain. Nothing fraudulent about that, no sir, or no senor. It's just what happens in Spain. Now I can tell you that Spanish healthcare is excellent from personal experience. Diesel on a roundabout, off a moped, hospital, very painful ribs, broken collarbone, they were brilliant. So it's not incompetence of Spanish healthcare workers when you die the same day you get COVID, nor when somehow 532% of the people who had COVID died of it. What? Yes, 5 times as many people died of COVID as had COVID. Remarkable. That's why lag 14 is so precious. It's the ultimate fraud indicators for nations that were lazy and just stuffed deaths. I always said you couldn't commit fraud in COVID without distorting your figures. Like any fraud, if you're lazy or clumsy, you leave a massive footprint. Here's that footprint, lag 14. So yes, once you get a warning light here, you need to check the chart, but no surprise to see the warnings going off for our worst hit nations. Now this is lag 7, the gentle indicator, but already we've got Spain up at 95% death rate. Remember, anything over 14% is basically impossible, barring ethnic cleansing or fraud or both by age risk. Lag 14 though is where it's at, and gee, look at that, the whole world drops away to normal, maybe a bit stressed, but that's what stress testing is about, isn't it? To see who fails. Look who fails. Ecuador has a rather bizarre relationship to reporting and data, which means that daily figures, which a lag figure is, are unreliable. You'd have to look at Ecuador's chart to evaluate it. Here it is. Yes, we already know from its early ranking that it must be one of the worst hit in the world. It's at 12 death days, a bad hit, but it's only 8.7% of overall mortality. That makes it a notable cause of death during this period, but nowhere close to being one of the big killers in our societies, not even for this short period. So yes, pity South America is having such issues with COVID when the rest of the world, barring agenda countries, is brushing it off, but there it is. So Ecuador, fine, bizarre but fine. Who are the bad boys of Stalag 14? New York City, 400%. Wow, 4 times as many people die of COVID as have COVID. No fraud there then. Belgium, high, looks about 60%, but kind of hiding down there. Sort of did it right. Now it's Belgium's neighbours, both in rankings and in real life. Gosh, what a coincidence. UK, 200%. Twice as many people dying from COVID as having COVID. No death stuffing there then. Spain, 500%. Wonderful. Italy, 150%. So sad, we felt such sympathy. To Italy? This chart is a neon sign saying, look at me, I'm fraudulent. And does the media notice? Of course not. I'll just show these full screen for a sec, the growth decline factors for cases and deaths. The what? Precisely. If you know what they are, you can peruse. Growth analysis, advanced topic. I was going to do a full chart summary as we started with, but I figured we'd really ought to share the summary data. So it's getting late, a lot of slides already, so let's just give you the UK to view. And we'll do the normal chart summary separately. That's it for now. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.